All right, we are moving up to Genesis chapter 48, 3 chapters to go on our walk through the book of Genesis. And we're nearing the end of Jacob's life, and we're going to see, I'll be honest with you, when I opened this, or when I started reading this chapter this week, I was a little nervous about it. I'm like, man, I got a little confused. So hopefully I've got it all straightened out. But there's a lot going on in this chapter, and it's interesting, and some of the things that we'll discuss here and point out this evening with Jacob, and he's passing on blessings as he's preparing to die and all these things. So we'll start in Genesis 48. And we'll go verses 1 through 4 to kick this off. And it came to pass after these things that one told Joseph, "Behold, thy father is sick." And he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And one told Jacob and said, "Behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee." And Israel strengthened himself and sat upon the bed. And Jacob said unto Joseph, "God Almighty appeared unto me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. And said unto me, Behold, I will make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, and I will make of thee a multitude of people, and I will give this land to thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession." So Joseph gets the word that his father is sick, again, nearing the end of his life. And so Joseph grabs his sons and goes to visit him. And upon hearing that Joseph was on his way, Jacob mustered the strength to sit up on the bed so that he could address and commune with Joseph and his 2 sons. Wow, totally just blew my mind there. And when they get there, Jacob is talking about God appearing unto him at Luz, which is another name for Bethel. And this is where Jacob first met God. And we get those references in Genesis 28 and also in Genesis 35. Where Jacob first met God, and Jacob is vividly remembering the outstanding encounter that he had with the Lord there at Luz. And, even more significant, he talks about, the promises that God made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And, it's very, very important that he quotes this exactly. In Genesis 17, God made promises to Abraham about the fruitfulness of his family and where they were going to settle in the land of Canaan. And obviously it shows that Abraham was very careful about how he worded this information as he passed it on to Isaac, and then Isaac again to Jacob, and now we see Jacob passing this promise on to Joseph. So, again, the exact words are very critical here, because we're talking about a covenant that God made between him and the Israelite people. And so, the importance of those exact words are evident here in the fact that he nails it, quotes it word for word from what we see in Genesis 17. This is a significant point. We think about everything that this family had been through, and that, Joseph is here with his 2 sons, and, Jacob, as we'll see here in verses 5 and 6, he understands the gravity of the situation here, and the fact that after he had thought Joseph was dead all these years, not only is he now sitting here talking with Joseph, but also with Joseph's 2 sons. And we'll read in verses 5 and 6. And now thy 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt, before I came unto thee into Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. And thy issue, which thou begettest after them, shall be thine, and shall be called after the name of their brethren in their inheritance. So he makes a reference to Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and equates them to Reuben and Simeon. Now, Reuben and Simeon are the first and second born of Jacob's lineage. And so he is basically adopting or taking the two sons of Joseph into the family at the highest level. He is putting them equal with all of his sons. And again, equating to Reuben and Simeon, basically making them the first and second born of his sons. And so, it's probably they're replacements for Reuben and Simeon at this point. We saw in Genesis 34 and Genesis 35 where Reuben and Simeon were basically disqualified from positions of status of leadership in Israel's family because of the sins they committed. So at this point, basically he is taking Joseph's two sons and replacing his first and second born with Manasseh and Ephraim. And so the adoption of them explains why in the Bible the 12 tribes of Israel are often listed in different combinations. This adoption actually makes 13 sons of Israel, as Joseph's portion is divided into two tribes. So you can arrange the tribes in different ways throughout the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, there's more than 20 different ways where the tribes are listed. But there is significance to the number 12, as we see in many places in the Bible. 12 often associated with government or administration in the eyes of God. But we look at all the instances of 12 in the Bible. There's 12 tribes, 12 apostles, 12 princes of Ishmael, 12 pillars on Moses' altar, 12 stones on the high priest's breastplate. There's 12 silver platters, silver bowls, and gold pans for the service of the tabernacle. 12 spies were sent out to search out the land. There were 12 governors under Solomon, 12 in each group of musicians or singers for Israel's worship. There's 12 hours in a day, 12 months in a year. There were 12,000 from the 12 tribes sealed and preserved throughout the tribulation. So we see all of these different things where the number 12 is very, very special to God. And so it's kind of ironic as we look at this and kind of say, well, now there's 13 sons, even though 12 is the number that is clearly very special. And if we look in verse 7, Jacob's going to continue. And as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died by me in the land of Canaan in the way, when yet there was but a little way to come unto Ephrath, and I buried her there in the way of Ephrath, the same is Bethlehem. And so we see, obviously Jacob still, it's not going to work. Sorry. There's obviously still grief, right? He still has grief from the passing of Rachel. And he's reminiscing, he's talking about it. Her death at the birth of their son, and then going into how she was buried. Carol, you're not praying hard enough. You get that itch in your throat, and it just doesn't go away. So that was in Genesis 35, where we saw the death of Rachel at the childbirth of Benjamin, and then her burial was described also in Genesis 35. And so, again, we're having this conversation, a conversation that many years ago Jacob would have never expected, to be there with Joseph, to be talking with Joseph and his two sons. So, he reviews the covenant. He goes over some of the historical things there and some of the remembrances. And now we come up to verse 8. In verse 8 through 12, we're going to see where he starts passing out blessings. And Israel beheld Joseph's sons and said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said unto his father, "They are my sons, whom God hath given me in this place." And he said, "Bring them, I pray thee, unto me, and I will bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim for age, so that he could not see. And he brought them near unto him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said unto Joseph, I had not thought to see thy face, and lo, God hath showed me also thy seed. And Joseph brought them out from between his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. I'm going to make it, I promise. And so, in his old age here, as he's, his sight is failing him, and he, he brings forth the two children of Joseph. This goes. All right. So, keeping in mind, Manasseh and Ephraim, there was significance to their names. Manasseh meaning forgetfulness, and Ephraim meaning fruitfulness. We saw that in Genesis chapter 41. And, we see here where Joseph, he bows down in front of his father. And even though he's been living now for many years as the second in command of all of Egypt, he still sees the reverence. We still see the reverence that he has towards his father here by bowing down before him. And, what we see here is culmination of a great example of how our circumstances are never out of God's control. Jacob got to see Joseph again. He thought for many, many years that he was dead. Very similar to other stories in the Bible where we saw everything that Job went through, and he got a new family. And, reminiscent of the story of Lazarus. And, he died, and Mary got her brother back. So our circumstances are never out of God's control, and that's what this is an example of. And if we move to verse 13 and read verses 13 and 14. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and brought them near unto him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, guiding his hands wittingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So, as Joseph brings his two sons to Jacob, he intentionally brings, one to the left-hand side and one to the right-hand side. And he had brought Manasseh to the right-hand side because he was the firstborn. I don't know if you remember, Jacob kind of had a problem with the rules of the firstborn and the rules of, I find it funny here because what we see is he puts his right hand on the youngest, Ephraim, and his left hand on, so he crosses his hands. This is a very, very intentional act. And, I did kind of find it ironic when I think about what Jacob did to get Esau's, what's the word I'm looking for? The blessing. So, clearly he had a problem with the rules. But, he crosses his hands and actually puts his right hand on the younger and his left hand on the older. And it's significant because, when we talk about the Bible, the right hand is the hand of strength, right? The right hand is very critical. We see it in Exodus 15. Do I have that slide? Thy right hand, O Lord, is become glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. And in Psalm 16:11, thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. And in Psalm 20, verse 6, now know that I, the Lord, saveth his anointed. He will hear him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. And in Mark 14:62, Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. And so, significant. And Joseph knows this, so he brings the oldest to the right-hand side, and then Jacob crosses his hands. Jacob knew exactly what he was going to do. He knew that he wanted to put his right hand on Ephraim's head because he wanted to grant a greater blessing to the younger. And again, this was very much against normal expectation. But what we see here is, again, God works in unexpected ways, right? Joseph clearly did not expect this, as we'll see here in the next verses. And we'll get this explanation, but when God chooses, it goes deeper than appearance, tradition, or position. So, it's not Israel having a problem with the rules. It is God guiding him, and we're going to see that here. But it's an example that God can use anyone. He can use me. He can use you. But if we look at verse 15 and read the next two verses, and he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which fed me all my life long unto this day, the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And so he gives into the blessing, and he again references back to his fathers. And so he grants this blessing. Again, there's deep awareness of the covenant that came from God's promise to Abraham and to Isaac. And he blessed Joseph by blessing Joseph's sons. So he gave the same blessing to both sons, but again, the son with the right hand receives a greater portion of the blessing. And, our text tells us here Jacob blessed Joseph, again, through his children, and that, as a parent, to see your children blessed, there's no greater thing that can happen on earth than to see your children blessed. And so, in Israel's history, both tribes were blessed, but it does pan out that Ephraim ends up being the greater tribe. And we see reference to the tribe of Ephraim as the whole northern nation of Israel in Isaiah chapter 7. And we see here in 7:8, for the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. And then in verse 17, the Lord shall bring upon thee and upon thy people and upon thy father's house days that have not come from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. So, again, Jacob was doing what God had led him to do. God knew Ephraim's tribe would be more significant. We see other examples in the Bible where, God chooses people very unexpectedly. We saw God choose Moses to do very great things in the future down the road. And, if you recall, Moses didn't really want to sign up for that duty. Why? Because he didn't speak well. So that was a very unexpected choice. God chose David to go and defeat Goliath. Well, nobody expected that because Goliath was a giant and David was a 16-year-old boy. And we saw God choose Saul. And, clearly Christians would never have expected Saul to be chosen as he was out hunting them. And, when we see Gideon and the army that he put together to take on the Amorites and the Midianites and all the other ites, he was facing an army of 135,000, and he had an army of 32,000 to take on an army of 135,000. You're like, wow, he's really outnumbered. And what did God say to Gideon? Nope, too many. And they whittled it down to 10,000 and said, still too many. And Gideon ended up taking them on with an army of 300. So, God likes to do the unexpected, as only God can. And all the excitement up here, I think I got my pages messed up. Give me a second. Nope, I'm good. So, Israel gave this blessing again, and it all fulfills the covenant. But he talks significantly about the God who has fed me. All right? Literally, this is the God who has shepherded me. And so this is the first mention in the Bible where God is mentioned as a shepherd to his people. And so when he talks about the God who has fed me, he's talking about the God who shepherded me. And so, think about how this is when we look again at this big contrast. He's giving God the credit for everything that's happened in his life. Here he is at the end of his life. He's giving God the credit for everything that happened in his life, which is a big contrast from the Jacob of his youth, right? In his youthful days, Jacob schemed to get what he wanted. And, you think about that. When people chase after what they want, they'll do anything to get it, right? It's just so much easier to trust God and that realize all good things come from him. So, again, as we see Jacob coming to the end of his life here, he has recognized that everything that he has come from God. And so we'll go to verse 17 and read verses 17 through 20. And when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand upon the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. And he held up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head unto Manasseh's head. And Joseph said unto his father, Not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Put thy right hand upon his head. And his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. And he blessed them that day, saying, In thee shall Israel bless, saying, God make thee as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. So again, he crossed his hands, had his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left hand on Manasseh's head. And Joseph, as Joseph took notice of that, he was disappointed. He was displeased. And he tried to change it. He tried to move Jacob's hand, and Jacob refused and said, I know what I'm doing. This is what God has told me. And so, again, an intentional act so that the younger is receiving the right-hand blessing. And, it is important that, firstborn in the Bible in many places doesn't necessarily mean literally firstborn. Because God uses that terminology of firstborn as a place of prominence, but doesn't necessarily have that literal meaning. Again, Ephraim, not the firstborn. God chose to give him the position of firstborn. And in Jeremiah 31, which I don't have a slide for, in verse 9, he actually, there's a statement in there about him being the father to Israel and Ephraim being the firstborn. And again, it shows the idea that firstborn doesn't necessarily mean first out of the womb. David was referenced as the firstborn, even though he was the youngest son. And this was in 1 Samuel and again in Psalm. And even Jesus in the book of Colossians was referenced as the firstborn. And, Jesus was not even a created creature of God. So it's significant in its place, but again, doesn't always necessarily mean the literal firstborn. And so as we move into the last two verses here, to wrap it up, verses 21 and 22, And Israel said unto Joseph, Behold, I die, but God shall be with you, and bring you again unto the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite, with my sword and with my bow. So it's the passing of the torch. He says, "Behold, I'm dying." Obviously, we already knew that coming into this. But Israel, Abraham, and Isaac, and then Jacob or Israel as the three great patriarchs, and this is now being passed on to Joseph and his sons. And this is a quote from Charles Spurgeon. If Abraham dies, there is Isaac, and if Isaac dies, there is Jacob. And if Jacob dies, there is Joseph, and if Joseph dies, Ephraim and Manasseh survive. The Lord shall never lack a champion to bear his standard high among the sons of men. Only let us pray God to raise up more faithful ministers day and night. We have plenty of a sort, but oh, for more that will weigh out 16 ounces to the pound of gospel in such a way that people will receive it. We have too much of fine language, too much of florid eloquence, and little full and plain gospel preaching, but God will keep up the apostolic succession. Never fear of that. When Stephen is dying, Paul is not far off. When Elijah is taken up, he leaves his mantle behind him. So again, we see this, being passed along as and he makes the reference that he's giving one portion above the brothers. And, this is the fact that Joseph is the father of two tribes, while all of his brothers only fathered one tribe. But, Joseph was used to being favored by his father, so it shouldn't have been a surprise that he got a bigger portion than everyone else. And he talks about the land that Jacob, took from the Amorites, that he was giving to Joseph, and that the descendants of Joseph would go to 400 years later. And he talks about again, this is Jacob's recognition of God's presence in his life throughout all of this. And as we look through different places here in the book of Genesis, where we get our assurances from God. In Genesis 28:15, young believers are given assurance of his presence, where he said, when God says, "I am with thee." In Genesis 31, growing believers can trust that God will be with them when he said, "I will be with thee." In Genesis 31 also, God gives a glorious testimony to mature believers. And when it says in there that God has been with me, and a mature believer even has the opportunity to encourage others. And we see it in Genesis 48, in verse 21 here, where he says, "God shall be with you." So, we've talked many times through this story here about Joseph being a picture of Jesus. And, all the different things, things that Joseph had in common with Jesus. This is that great example that we can all live by and take to heart. But as we get to the end here of Jacob's life, and knowing now that the blessing is being passed on to Joseph and to his two sons, the stage is now being set for the time that the Israelites will end up becoming slaves in the land of Egypt. And, but again, the whole purpose of them moving to Goshen there in Egypt was to get them away from the Canaanites so that they could flourish. And we continue to see flourishing and moving on just like God had said that they would. And so you have the chariots, you have the wagons, you have all of this, this giant parade, leaving Egypt, heading to Canaan. And they get to the threshing floor of Atad, so they get beyond the Jordan River, and there they stop. And again, they're in a time of mourning, okay? And it says that it was a great and very sore lamentation. So for 7 more days now, we continue the mourning of the death of Jacob. So this becomes again, very dramatic, very touching. The entire Jewish clan came together to pay tribute. This was, again, the final link to Abraham, to Isaac, with the passing of Jacob. And so, when we think about Jacob and his grandfather, Abraham, his life overlapped the sons of Noah. So we see that it brings this whole link in this lineage. And, there's probably no other burial with quite as much fanfare that we'll see in the Bible. Even Jesus' burial didn't have any fanfare, right? That was not, it was his resurrection that had all the fanfare. It was not his burial. He was put in a tomb with a rock rolled in front of it. But we see all of this detail and the honor that was paid to Jacob through this and the time that they were mourning. We also see this as probably a time for his sons to rededicate themselves to God with the passing of their father, taking on the additional pressure or taking on that mantle of leadership. And, again, remembering the covenant that God made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and knowing that was passed on to the sons of Joseph. So this is preparing them for the test that is coming to them now, right? So that their dedication to God from this point on is going to get a great test over the next several hundred years, up to the time of their exodus from the land of Egypt. So again, very, very dramatic, a lot of fanfare here, and that even the people in the land of Canaan took notice of what was going on and with this time of mourning in the floor of Atad. So that'll bring us to verse 12, and we'll read verses 12 through 14. And his sons did unto him according as he commanded them. For his sons carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with the field for a possession of a burying place of Ephron the Hittite before Mamre. And Joseph returned into Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went up with him to bury his father, after he had buried his father. And so it's good to see that Jacob's sons, while they, gave him much disappointment in his life, at this point, in his death, they did not disappoint him. They were able to honor him the way that he wanted to be. They were able to bury him where he wanted to be buried. So, a point of redemption for his sons, that even though there was much opposition during his life and the disappointment, that they came through here at the end. And so they buried him in a cave in the field of Machpelah. So this was the land that was purchased by Abraham. We saw that in Genesis 23 and verse 9. It is the only part of the land of Canaan that Abraham held the deed to. And we saw that in verse 17 of Genesis 23. And then, again, this is a burial place for Sarah. That was in Genesis 23:19. It's the burial place of Abraham. We saw that in Genesis 25:9. And Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah. And that was just brought up in chapter 49 and verse 31. So we just saw that last week. So again, this is the family burial ground. And, I often think many of us have family burial grounds, right? I know this past summer I was able to take Sam down to Kentucky to the school that he went to, and we went to his family cemetery, right? And it was up on top of a hill, and it was interesting to see. And obviously, Sam likes to tell stories, so we had a good time doing that. But I just recently was at my family's burial ground at the cemetery in Dillsboro, Indiana, and we took note of the many family members who are not dead, who already had their names on headstones. So it was kind of, I understand this, right? This sense of the belonging and having that family burial ground. And so, it's good that they were able to do that for Jacob. But now that the time of mourning is over, they have now returned back to Egypt. And we see Joseph's brothers get a little worried. And in verse 15, and when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. So we see here that the what maybe that his brothers felt were the buffer, or what was keeping them out of trouble with Joseph, their father, he is now gone. Oh no, Joseph's going to get us now. There's nothing, there's nothing to stop him. And obviously human nature, and I know I have talked about this many times during this story, when his brothers came to him the first time and all these different things that happen, and I'm like, man, I would just, I'm going to stick it to him and do all these things. And that's never what Joseph was doing. He was doing what God led him to do. So obviously his brothers, understanding human nature, especially their human nature and the wicked things that they had done in their past, they're worried. Also keep in mind, Joseph is the second in command of Egypt and could probably do whatever he wanted at this point, right? And so they come to this point that they're worried that he's going to repay them the evil that they did to him. And so obviously they are again acknowledging what they did to Joseph and that it was bad, right? But I think what we also see here is they fear retribution, or they're worried about Joseph trying to get his justice on them, that they are thinking less of Joseph than they probably should. But again, they're looking at it from a worldly perspective. They're looking at it from a human perspective, and knowing that we all like to see somebody get what's coming to him, right? When that guy buzzes by you on the highway and you see him pulled over later, you're like, yes. That's not how we should be, right? We should pray that they safely get to their destination. But so that human nature. So now, it's all coming back to them. They still feel guilt for what they did, and that is obvious. And so they want to get out ahead of it, which they've been very good at doing since the famine began, right? Of trying to get out ahead of things. So his brothers, again, are going to try and get out ahead of what they fear is coming their way. So we'll see this in verses 16 through 18. And they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, Thy father did command before he died, saying, So shall ye say unto Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren, and their sin, for they did unto thee evil. And now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants. Going back to the dream, right? How many times has his brothers now fallen on their faces in front of him? And that whole image is what started them down the path of hating Joseph and wanting to kill Joseph and selling Joseph into slavery. But yet here they are one more time on their face, begging for mercy, basically. And so they come up with this story. Remember, your father said, all right? I don't remember Jacob telling Joseph that he needed to show mercy to his brothers. I don't remember reading that. Maybe I missed it, but I think they are making this up. Probably trying to take advantage of some emotion of the time, coming out of this morning with the father just passing. But they also probably didn't feel like they had the right to ask for mercy, because again, they are acknowledging what they did was very, very bad. They know that they sinned against Joseph. They know they sinned against Jacob. They know they sinned against God. So they put their request for mercy in Jacob's mouth, basically. Again, I think looking for an opportunity to play a little bit off of the emotion of the situation. But they obviously are saying, hey, be nice to your brothers, it's okay. And so as this word gets to Joseph, it says Joseph wept when they spake unto him. Well, why do you think Joseph wept in this situation? He's had many a good cry through the chapters that we've had, but here we see him weeping. Why do you think he's weeping after his brothers are basically trying to confirm that he's not going to come out and get them? Well, I think it's because he thought, it bothered him that they thought so little of his character. That they thought after all of this time, he was still waiting for his dad to die so he could get back at him. Because we know that that's never been the case. So they hurt his feelings, right? I think it broke his heart a little bit here to know that there was doubt from his brethren after everything that's happened, that they are still concerned that Joseph is going to repay them for the evil that they did to him. And so he wept because his heart was broken. But again, we see them falling down on their face in front of their brother one more time. And so what we see here is they're backing up their plea with genuine humility, right? They are still showing him the reverence, it's not reverence, that's the wrong word, the respect that he deserves being who he is in Egypt. So, again, remember what he was looking for when they came to Egypt the first time, right? He was looking for them to show that they understood that they did wrong. He was looking for that humbleness, that humility, those kind of things. And we see that here on display, even though, they're maybe making up some words to go through this. They are on their faces in front of him, showing that genuine display of humility. And so Joseph is upset that his brothers don't trust him, but let's see how he responds to that in verse 19. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore, fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. Now, I think I'd be tired of trying to convince them that everything was all right. I know I would. I don't think I would. I'd be like, what is wrong with you people? Get over yourselves. But what do we see Joseph doing here? He's comforting them. He's using his kind words. But he starts this statement off with, am I in the place of God? Right? He is making the point that retribution or getting even with them is not his place, right? It's God's place. So he's going straight at it and he's saying, well, this isn't for me. This is up to God. And so, I love how he leads in straight with that, right? It's not his job to make his brothers pay for what they did, all right? It's God's place. And so, if the Lord chose to punish his brothers for the evil things that they've done, he's going to use some other tool other than Joseph, right? Joseph is not going to be the instrument of God's retribution here. Now, again, from my perspective, maybe from your perspective, Joseph had every right to be angry. That's the way I would look at it, right? He has every right to be angry, He has every right to be angry, and he has all the ability to bring the retribution because of his place in Egypt. But he doesn't. He knew, that's not what God wanted. And so, with retribution being up to God and not to Joseph, it's not going to happen. All right? And then we come back to a familiar statement and passage that we've talked about many times here in the last few weeks. Number one, Joseph did not mince words. He's not romanticizing what happened. He's very, very quick to point out that what his brothers did was wrong, what they did to him was wrong. He says, you meant evil against me, right? Man, that's a pretty clear statement. And so, while this is true, the greater truth of the whole situation was God used it for good, right? What they meant for evil, God meant for good. And as a Christian, we should be able to see God's hand in even the bad things that happen to us. And I can look back through my life, and I can see where things that I thought were the worst things that ever happened to me were the best things that ever happened to me. When they're happening in the moment, I don't usually see it that way. It's very, very difficult to see, I get all down in my feelings and I want to go out in the garden and eat worms. I can go to that place very, very quickly. But I can look back and see, again, what God, what bad things can happen to me, God can use those for good. And so Joseph didn't have Romans 8:28, hadn't been written at that time, but he knew the truth of Romans 8:28. And Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. And so Joseph knew that evil was worked into God's framework, into God's plans. And, again, we have the text. We have Romans 8:28. We can read it as many times as we want, and yet I still struggle to see that in real time. But again, at the end of the day, our lives are not in the hands of the people around us, right? Our lives are in God's hands, and we need to trust him. And no matter what happens, it's all for God's glory. I came across this story of a minister, right? And he was always very good at being able to minister people at the worst time, at their worst time. If they were distressed, they were discouraged. And he had this old bookmark that he used as part of trying to encourage people. And the bookmark it was a very nice bookmark, and it had silk. It had a motto woven into it in silk on one side. But on the back of it, where the threads on the back side, the threads were knotted and they were tied, and there was this tangle, and you couldn't see what it said. And so he would take the bookmark out, and he would show it to people in their troubled times. And he would show them the back side of the bookmark and ask them to tell them what the bookmark said. And, nobody could, because it's just this massive tangle of thread. When he would turn it over, on the front of it, in white letters, on this solid blue background, it very simply said, God is love. All right? And so, when our life seems a tangled mess, when we can't find the meaning of the things that are happening to us, God is love. God is still there for us. He is still in control of everything that we have going on around us. And then, to go along with the theme of, all things work together for good, Joseph says, God meant unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. All right? The immediate good in the situation was the Israelites were becoming their own nation, right? We've talked about it. They were getting intermingled in Canaan. So the fact that the famine came and it forced them into Egypt, and they were able to be put in Goshen, where they would be ignored by Egyptians because they were dirty sheep herders, all worked out for the saving of this entire nation, who probably would have perished in the famine, or if they had barely survived, would have been basically Canaanites. So them coming to Egypt preserved them, allowed them to become the distinct nation of Israel. And so, I'm going to run through everything that's happened to Joseph, all these bad things here, and how they turned into something good. So, remember, if Joseph's brothers had not sold him to the Midianites, then he would not have gone to Egypt. And if he had not gone to Egypt, he'd have never been sold to Potiphar. And if he had not been sold to Potiphar, then Potiphar's wife would not have accused him of rape. And if he had not been accused by her of rape, he'd have never been put in prison. And these things are all terrible, right? This is awful. Think about all the bad things that happened to him. But if he had never been put into prison, he'd have never met the butler and the baker. And if he had never met them, he would not have interpreted their dreams. And if he had not interpreted their dreams, then he would have never interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. And if he had not interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he would not have become the second in command of Egypt. And if he had not become the second in command of Egypt, he would have never been able to prepare Egypt for the famine. And if he had not been there to prepare Egypt for the famine, then his family in Canaan would have probably died in the famine. And if his family had died in Canaan, then the Messiah would not have come from a dead family. And if the Messiah had not come, we would not have Jesus on earth. And if Jesus had never come, then we'd be dead in our sins right now. We would never have the opportunity to have the hope that we have now in Jesus. And I, for one, am grateful that all these things happened to Joseph, that Joseph handled them the way that he did. And, you know, we're here today because of that. And then, back to the whole point where he comforted them and used his kind words, where I'd have been like, come on, get over yourself. You know, again, Joseph trusted God. He saw God's hand in all of the bad things that happened to him, and he showed love and compassion to his brothers because of this. And, you know, a lot of times we have trouble loving others because we have bitterness in our hearts. You know, maybe not towards them, maybe just bitterness in general. I've gone through some times of bitterness in my life. Cynicism and apathy, right, Stephen? You know, it's about knowing who God is, trusting him, because he is who he says he is. And then, you know, as he's speaking kindly to them, he also gives them this assurance that he will provide for them, and he will provide for their little ones. It says the word nourish. Joseph's love for his brothers is not just shown in the words that he's using, but also in practical action. And you would think that his brothers would have gotten that by now, right? He has given them everything that they have on earth, basically, at this point. So he has shown through this time, through his actions, that he has provided for them, and he assures them that he is going to continue to provide in them. And so now we come to the end of Joseph's life in verse 22 through verse 24. And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you, and bring you out of his land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So now we see, again, here at the end of Joseph's life, 110 years, good run. But he's got his grandchildren on his knees. And for those of you that have grandchildren, you know, you can tell me about how awesome that is. I do hope someday to be able to share in that experience. They're over there, they can't hear me. But, you know, he's at the end of his life. Again, we see the evidence of God's blessing on Joseph's life as he's there with his grandchildren, right? He is seeing, you know, the generations beyond him now. And all the hardships that he had in his life didn't diminish his ability to enjoy these blessings. You know, God gave him the ultimate blessing throughout his whole life, and he was open to God throughout all of those things. And again, as the person on earth who was most responsible for bringing his family to Egypt, you know, he played a very important role in the nation of Israel. But he knew it wasn't because of him. He knew it was the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he knew that he also wanted to be buried at the family cemetery. So, he also knew that at some point he would go back to Canaan. And so, in verse 25, and Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you. Did I skip? Nope, I'm good, right? Yeah. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And I was talking to Sandy this morning, all these chapters about Joseph and his death is in one verse. And it's the last verse of the book of Genesis. And so, Joseph was put in a coffin in Egypt. He was embalmed and put in a coffin in Egypt. And in Hebrews 11:22, we see, by faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. So as he died, he made prophecy saying that at some point the land of Israel is going to leave Egypt and he's going to go with them. And so he was never buried. He was in a coffin 400 years above ground until they went till the Exodus and the Israelites went back to the land of Canaan. So this was a silent witness there in Egypt for all the future generations. Joseph obviously had a very incredible and dramatic life. But in the end, we see why he was in the museum of faith. All right, again, by faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. Right? When you all go back to Canaan, take my bones with you. And so we see this faith because, again, he continues to trust in the covenant that God made, in God and the covenant that God made with his people. All right? He showed through his faith that he knew where God's people belonged. He showed through his faith that he looked to the future, knowing they would go back there. And, this was faith because it proclaimed God's faithful promise in any way possible, including his bones being carried back to Canaan. And so this promise was fulfilled 400 years later, give or take, again, when Israel left Egypt. And we see that in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 19, and it says, And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones away hence with you. And so Moses, as they were preparing to leave Egypt, made sure they got Joseph's bones, and that was probably a pretty good idea. So again, during all this time, that coffin was there with Joseph's body in it, and it was evidence of a promise that God had made throughout the turmoil, because I can't imagine that in the next 400 years, once Joseph was dead, things got pretty rough for the Israelites, right? They went from being guests in the land of Goshen to slaves. But they had this evidence there and the promise that, Joseph was reminding them of that God made. And so Joseph died looking forward to God's plan, all right, the plan of redemption that he had for the people of Israel. And that is where Genesis ends, keeping in mind Genesis is the book of beginnings, but this is the end of it there. It's that promise of the future that the Israelites have. So it concludes looking forward to a continuation of God's eternal love, his wise plan, and thank God we're all in it. If we're saved, we are all part of that plan.